From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I don't know what else to say other than Obamacare is the law of the land. It's going to remain the law of the land until it's replaced.
President Trump suffers his first major legislative defeat as House Republicans pull a bill to repeal the Affordable Care Act. The White House is now vowing to let Obamacare explode. Meanwhile, advocates of single-payer say now is the time to push for a system where all Americans have health care. Then to the Keystone XL pipeline.
Today, I'm pleased to announce the official approval of the presidential permit for the Keystone XL pipeline.
We'll speak to Bill McKibben of 350.org, who helped organize the massive resistance against the project, leading President Obama to reject the Keystone XL. McKibben is involved with the major march on Washington, April 29th. Then we look at the soaring number of civilians being killed in U.S. airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, including over 200 civilians in a strike in the Iraqi city of Mosul in a single day.
I came to the house to stay with my family, but the owner of the house told me there were no place for me. More than 100 people were inside. Half an hour later, the house was hit in an airstrike.
We'll speak with Chris Woods, founder of the group Air Wars. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Obamacare is the law of the land. That's what House Speaker Paul Ryan said Friday after he pulled the Republicans' health care law with President Trump's support only minutes before the vote was scheduled. He pulled the legislation after it was clear he'd failed to muster enough votes for the bill to pass. Both President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence had heavily lobbied Republican lawmakers ahead of the vote, but the bill was opposed by the entire Democratic Party as well as many members of the ultra-conservative House Freedom Caucus and some moderate Republicans. This is House Speaker Paul Ryan speaking to reporters shortly after pulling the bill.
I don't know what else to say other than Obamacare is the law of the land. It's going to remain the law of the land until it's replaced. We did not have quite the votes to replace this law. And so, yeah, we're going to be living with Obamacare for the foreseeable future. I don't know how long it's going to take us to replace this law.
While President Trump initially blamed Democrats for the legislative failure, he switched his focus to fellow Republicans over the weekend. On Sunday morning, he tweeted, "Democrats are smiling in D.C. that the Freedom Caucus, with the help of Club for Growth and Heritage, have saved Planned Parenthood and Obamacare." Sunday morning was that tweet. On Sunday, Texas Congressmember Ted Poe resigned from the Freedom Caucus in protest of the group's opposition to the Republican health care plan. Meanwhile, Politico is reporting that the push to pass the legislation was harmed in part because Trump, unlike many Congress members, did not appear to know that much or care that much about the details of health care policy. Following his first major legislative failure, Trump warned that he is now going to let Obamacare explode.
For the last year and a half, that the best thing we can do, politically speaking, is let Obamacare explode. It is exploding right now. It's many states have big problems. Almost all states have big problems.
We'll have more on the Republicans' plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, as well as a push among a number of progressives and others for single payer after headlines. The U.S.-backed Iraqi military's ground campaign to retake West Mosul from ISIS has been halted as details emerged over the weekend about the U.S.-led coalition airstrikes that killed over 200 people, it's believed, in a single day. The U.S.-led coalition has admitted launching the March 17th airstrikes that targeted a crowded section of Mosul. At least one strike reportedly hit an explosive-filled truck, triggering a blast that destroyed nearby houses where hundreds of people were taking refuge amidst the city's heavy fighting. Up to 80 civilians, including women and children, may have died in one house's basement alone. The March 17th strikes appear to be among the deadliest U.S. airstrikes in the region since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Over the weekend, witnesses told The Guardian some of their family members remain trapped under the rubble after days of U.S. coalition airstrikes battered neighborhoods in and around West Mosul. This is a family member of some of the civilians killed in that strike.
I came to the house to stay with my family, but the owner of the house told me there were no place for me. More than 100 people were inside. Half an hour later, the house was hit in an airstrike. There were neither snipers nor ISIL militants on the street. At least 15 people from this street that links into the alleyways have been killed.
The journalistic Project Air Wars reports as many as 1,000 civilians have died in U.S.-led coalition airstrikes in Iraq and Syria in March alone, the high civilian death tolls leading many to question whether the U.S. military has loosened the rules of engagement that seek to limit civilian casualties. The Pentagon maintains the rules have not changed. We'll have more on U.S.-led airstrikes, including the devastating strikes in Mosul, later in the broadcast. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports Defense Secretary James Mattis is asking the Trump administration to lift Obama-era restrictions so the U.S. military can provide more support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. The U.S. already authorizes weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and provides other assistance, including mid-air refueling to Saudi warplanes for the ongoing bombing campaign. On Sunday, tens of thousands of Yemenis rallied in the streets of Sana'a to protest the Saudi-led war, which has led to thousands of deaths and sparked a humanitarian crisis with the threat of widespread famine. The fifth round of Syrian peace talks have begun in Geneva. The negotiations opened as at least 16 civilians, including women and children, were killed by an airstrike at a market in a suburb of Damascus on Saturday. In Russia, as many as 600 people were arrested amidst nationwide anti-corruption demonstrations Sunday. The tens of thousands of protesters were demanding the resignation of Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. Among those arrested was anti-corruption activist and opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who revealed the prime minister used a web of charities to conceal that he owns a slew of luxury real estate yachts and an Italian vineyard. The demonstrations were among the biggest protests in years in Russia. Meanwhile, hundreds of protesters were arrested Saturday in the neighboring country of Belarus. The arrests came after thousands of people defied a protest ban and poured into the streets of the capital, Minsk, to denounce attacks on people who are unemployed. Back in the United States, the Washington Post is reporting President Trump plans to unveil a new White House office today, which will be run by his son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner. The Post reports the White House Office of American Innovation will be staffed by former business executives who will be given wide-ranging authority to overhaul federal bureaucracy and even privatize some of the government's functions. On Sunday, Kushner told the Washington Post, quote, "The government should be run like a great American company. Our hope is we can achieve successes and efficiencies for our customers, who are the citizens," unquote. Democratic lawmakers have introduced a new piece of legislation demanding the Trump administration publish visitor logs, not only for the White House, but also for the private resorts where Trump conducts business, including his Florida resort, Mar-a-Lago. The legislation is known as the Mar-a-Lago Act, which is an acronym for the full title, Making Access Records Available to Lead American Government Openness Act. This past weekend, Trump spent time at the Trump National Golf Club in Virginia, marking the 8th straight weekend the president has spent time at Trump-branded private properties. While Trump was at the Trump National Golf Club in Virginia Saturday, his supporters held pro-Trump rallies in cities across the country. In Huntington Beach, California, the rally descended into chaos and violence after some pro-Trump demonstrators attacked anti-Trump counter-protesters. A viral video shows a Trump supporter swinging a flagpole at the head of an anti-Trump protester. The flag read, "Trump, make America great again." South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham faced an audience of angry constituents at a town hall meeting on Saturday. The audience repeatedly booed Senator Graham and at times chanted, "Your last term." This is Senator Graham trying to defend his decision to back Trump's Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch.
We just finished the hearing this week. Judge Gorsuch was one of the finest people I think President Trump could have chosen. I am going to enthusiastically support him. And if the Democrats try to filibuster him, they will be making a huge mistake.
The Senate narrowly voted Thursday to dismantle Internet privacy protections established under the Obama administration. The measures were pushed by Republican lawmakers, and the vote largely split across party lines. The bill, which is now heading to the House, will give companies like Verizon, Comcast, and AT&T more power to collect people's data, including their Internet browsing history, and to sell this information. More than 1,000 Jewish activists and their allies descended on Washington, D.C. Sunday to protest the annual policy conference held by AIPAC. That's the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Vice President Mike Pence, a keynote speaker at this year's AIPAC conference, which opened only days after the Senate confirmed Trump's bankruptcy lawyer, David Friedman, to serve as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Friedman's a backer of Israel's Jewish-only settlements in the Palestinian territories. A recently published UN report accused the Israeli government of imposing an apartheid regime on the Palestinians. During Sunday's protests, some of the young Jewish activists chained themselves to the doors of the conference center, while others dropped banners from inside. This is Dr. Cornel West speaking to activists outside the conference.
We come from a very rich and deep prophetic tradition. It goes back to Amos and Jeremiah and Esther. It goes back to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Albert Einstein and Muriel Rukeyser and so many others. And so we tell some of our more conservative brothers and sisters on the inside that you do not represent the best of the Jewish prophetic tradition, and we here to bear witness.
In Chile, hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets nationwide to protest Chile's privatized pension system Sunday. Protesters say the system benefits the rich while leaving the poor with a monthly pension below the minimum wage. Activists say as many as 2 million people protested nationwide, more than 10% of the country's population. This is activist Luis Messina.
We hope in this large protest to express exactly with a majority viewpoint that we workers will not rest until this cursed system that condemns our parents and our grandparents to miserable pensions is ended.
In Argentina, thousands of people took to the streets across the country Friday to mark the 41st anniversary of the 1976 military coup that ousted President Isabel Perón. The coup ushered in a bloody U.S.-backed dictatorship under which as many as 30,000 people were disappeared. During Friday's nationwide demonstrations, family members carried signs with photos of their loved ones who were missing from that period. In Colombia, the town of Cajamarca has voted by a landslide to halt the plans for the South African-based corporation Anglo Gold Ashanti to build a massive open-pit gold mine. The website Colombia Reports says the vote marks the first time a Colombian town has ever voted to ban mining in its territory. Meanwhile, in central China, at least 11 people have died in 2 separate accidents at gold mines in Henan province on Friday. In South Korea, prosecutors are seeking an arrest warrant for the former president, Park Geun-hye, who was removed from office earlier this month amidst a corruption scandal that sparked massive nationwide protests. Prosecutors are seeking to arrest her on charges of bribery and abuse of power. In Britain, as many as 50,000 people took to the streets on Saturday to protest Brexit, Britain's plans to leave the European Union. This is protester Poppy Samaji.
For me, it's especially important because I was too young to vote, and I felt that there were a lot of people my age, like-minded, who didn't want this to happen. Like we know, it wasn't a majority vote. And a massive factor is that we're brother and sister. We come from a background of Hungarian immigrants. Our grandfather came here during the uprising. And just the hate that you feel as a result of Brexit and as a result of this increase in xenophobia.
British Prime Minister Theresa May has announced she'll send the formal paperwork known as Article 50 letter notifying the European Union of Britain's exit on Wednesday. The paperwork will set off a 2-year negotiation about the terms of the exit. Back in the United States, at least 1 person died and at least 15 more were injured when gunfire erupted in a crowded nightclub early Sunday morning in Cincinnati, Ohio. Police say more than 1 person was involved in the shooting at the Cameo nightclub. Police say the incident appears to have stemmed from from a dispute earlier in the day. And in Mexico, journalists marched through the streets of Mexico City Saturday to protest the killing of 3 of their colleagues this month. This is Mexican photographer Luis Barón.
The motive for the protest is to condemn the killings of the journalists Miroslava Breach, Cecilio Pineda, and Ricardo Bonluis, which means 3 colleagues have been killed in the last 4 months, and others have been injured, and authorities do nothing. Regrettably, the inaction in any state in the country in which journalists are injured or any freedom of expression is undermined is plain. Nothing happens.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We turn now to health care. Under President Obama, House Republicans voted more than 50 times to repeal or rewrite the Affordable Care Act. But on Friday, the House couldn't muster the votes needed to pass its own health care law, what some call Trump Care. Just minutes before the vote was scheduled, President Trump pushed House Speaker Paul Ryan to pull the legislation. The bill was opposed by every Democrat as well as many members of the ultra-conservative House Freedom Caucus and some moderate Republicans. The House Freedom Caucus wanted more drastic cuts to Obamacare, while the moderate Republicans were concerned about the potential fallout from the bill, which would have left 24 million more people uninsured while giving a major tax break to the rich.
President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence had heavily lobbied Republican lawmakers ahead of the vote. But the push from the White House didn't work, leading to Trump's first major legislative failure. House Speaker Paul Ryan spoke to reporters shortly after pulling the bill.
I don't know what else to say other than Obamacare is the law of the land. It's going to remain the law of the land until it's replaced. We did not have quite the votes to replace this law. Yeah, we're going to be living with Obamacare for the foreseeable future. I don't know how long it's going to take us to replace this law.
At the White House, President Trump warned he is now just going to let Obamacare explode.
Thank you very much. We were very close. It was a very, very tight margin. We had no Democrat support. We had no votes from the Democrats. They weren't going to give us a single vote, so it's a very difficult thing to do. I've been saying for the last year and a half that the best thing we can do, politically speaking, is let Obamacare explode. It is exploding right now. It's many states have big problems. Almost all states have big problems.
While Trump initially blamed Democrats for the legislative failure, he switched his focus to fellow Republicans over the weekend. On Sunday morning, he tweeted, quote, Democrats are smiling in D.C. that the Freedom Caucus, with the help of Club for Growth and Heritage, have saved Planned Parenthood and Obamacare. Trump tweeted Sunday morning. A day earlier, he urged on Twitter his Twitter followers to watch Judge Jeanine on Fox News on Saturday night. Viewers who tuned in would have heard this.
My opening statement. Paul Ryan needs to step down as Speaker of the House. The reason? He failed to deliver the votes on his health care bill, the one trumpeted to repeal and replace Obamacare, the one that he had 7 years to work on, the one he hid under lock and key in the basement of Congress, the one that had to be pulled to prevent the embarrassment of not having enough votes to pass. But this bill didn't just fail. It failed when Republicans had the House, the Senate, the White House.
That's Judge Jeanine Pirro on Fox News on Saturday. While House Speaker Paul Ryan remains in that position, many observers say he's been politically damaged. Politico is reporting the push to pass the legislation was harmed in part because Trump didn't appear to know that much or care that much about the details of health care policy, unlike many Congress members who came to him with questions. The Wall Street Journal reports the Trump administration is now ramping up its efforts to weaken the Affordable Care Act by pushing through rule changes and issuing new waivers. Meanwhile, Senator Bernie Sanders has announced he'll soon introduce a bill to create single-payer health care. Several progressive groups are backing a single-payer system, including the Working Families Party, the Progressive Campaign Change Committee, Credo, Social Security Works, and National Nurses United. We're joined now by Dr. Steffi Wohlhandler, co-founder of Physicians for a National Health Program, professor at CUNY Hunter College, primary care physician, lecturer at Harvard Medical School. You never supported Obamacare, but you were very critical of what was happening in Congress, Steffi. Can you talk about what did take place, and then what is being talked about now, not in the corporate media, almost no mention of single payer this weekend, but among progressive politicians and activists?
Well, our group, Physicians for a National Health Program, thinks we need to be moving forward from the Affordable Care Act to single payer and not backward through repeal like the Republicans wanted. You know, we thought it was a very big victory this weekend to block the Republican plan. We think it's from people showing up at those town hall meetings, pushing senators and congressmen in purple states, and making it impossible for the Republicans to do a straight repeal, which is what the Freedom Party wanted and which they'd been talking about for the last 7 or 8 years. So this was a victory, but there's still a lot more fighting to go. We're very heartened to see Senator Sanders and other politicians endorsing the idea of single payer. Certainly within the medical community, there's a tremendous amount of discussion and media coverage of the single payer idea. And we think it's a great time to be putting that idea forward and moving to a Medicare for All program.
But when you say it was a victory, as Trump has said he's vowing to, he said he would let the Obamacare both implode and explode at the same time. But he is basically, what could he do now, from an executive position, to be able to further damage the ability of people to access health care?
Well, unfortunately, there's a lot he can do through the regulatory process. You have to have regulatory underpinnings of a health law, and his secretary, Tom Price, Secretary of Health and Human Services, is a staunch opponent of the ACA, who's been trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act for years. So,
in fact, when Trump had his press conference, if you can call it that, on Friday, his press moment, standing on one side of him was Vice President Pence, on the other side was Price.
Right. So I think we're going to see the Affordable Care Act have death by 1,000 cuts. They're going to do everything they can from a regulatory standpoint, from a funding standpoint, to undermine Obamacare, weaken it, bleed it to death, if you will.
But talk about how they can do that, because they're really set on that. They're saying actually that President Obama set 2017 as the year for it to implode. But they say that they're just going to let it die. What does that mean? And how would they accelerate this, and how could they stop that?
Okay. Well, there's lots of regulatory decisions you make about what you're going to insist insurance companies do. That's all in Tom Price's bailiwick right now. So-called Medicaid waivers, where you say to the states, hey, we'll give you the money and let you do pretty much what you want. Of course, Tom Price is going to be doing that with a lot of these conservative state governments that have no interest in the Medicaid program or in helping poor people. There's been a lot of lawsuits.
So just to be clear on the waiver issue, that would in essence let them do what they were wanting to do in the current bill, which was create sort of a block grant situation for states on Medicaid?
Well, it's not quite the same as what they're going to do in the bill, but it does allow them to do things like charge Medicaid enrollees premiums. I have to remind you, these people are really, really poor, and if you require them to pay premiums, some months they're just not going to be able to pay, and they're going to lose their health care. The other thing I want to remind you of is there's been tons of lawsuits against Obamacare, which under the Obama administration, the Justice Department defended and fought against. But the Trump Justice Department doesn't have to defend against those lawsuits. So these lawsuits to cut funding and to restrict access to care that have failed to date will much more likely to succeed if the Justice Department is not fighting them. So Trump is going to own the health care system. I know he and Bannon want to blame the Democrats for the mess that the health care system is going to be, but they own it. There's a whole lot of problems with Obamacare, like the 26 million people who remain uninsured despite Obamacare. Trump is not going to fix that. He's going to probably make it worse. The high co-payments and deductibles.
Just to be clear on that.
Yeah.
Already over the next 10 years, 24 million people were going to lose their health care under the Republican plan. But you're talking about 26, 24 million people beyond what Obama had insured.
Well, I'm talking about right now, while Obamacare is fully in place, or, January 1, Obamacare fully in place, there are 26 million uninsured Americans. That's not universal health care. That's almost 10% of the population with no health care. And that's why our physicians organization is saying we need to move forward to single payer. We need to insure those people.
Now, it's interesting that one of their big problems was the 55 to 65-year-old lot that were they're under the Republican plan. Their prices, the cost of their insurance was going to escalate. Wouldn't it have been interesting if they had just said, OK, we'll lower Medicare to 55, and that would have taken care of all that. So I want to turn to Congressmember Peter Welch, the Democrat from Vermont. His remarks earlier this month during the Energy and Commerce Committee's markup of the American Health Care Act, the Republican plan.
There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that this bill has just appeared yesterday and that it was being hidden. Was it really being hidden from Democrats in America, or was it being hidden from your Freedom Caucus? They say that this bill is a phony repeal of Obamacare. And you want to know something? They're right, because there is a lot of plagiarism in this bill. The insurance reforms that all of you voted against, you're now bragging you're keeping. The subsidies that you say are horrible, you have changed from a direct subsidy that actually provided meaningful access to health care to on-the-cheap tax credits that don't do the job. But that's an entitlement that you say you're against. The mandate, you've decried the mandate, but what you've done is imposed a 30% penalty, and the revenues don't go to the health care program, the revenues go to the insurance companies. What is going on here?
Gentleman's time.
So that is Vermont Congressmember Peter Welch, who, together with Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, says they will both introduce legislation for single payer. So if you could respond to what he said and then talk about what their plan is and your thoughts on it.
Well, the Republican plan, which was defeated, was just a meaner version of the Affordable Care Act. Unfortunately, both of those acts have left the private insurance industry in the center of the healthcare system, and we actually need to get the private health insurance industry out. Their overhead and profits and the overhead that they impose on doctors and hospitals are costing us $500 billion annually that we do not need to be spending, $500 billion annually that we could save through a single-payer program, use that money to cover the 26 million Americans who now have no coverage, and then to improve the coverage of insured Americans who often have insurance they can't afford to use because of the high co-payments, the high deductibles. Now, the deductibles and co-payments, that's a problem that predated Obamacare, but Obamacare failed to fix, and a single payer could eliminate that problem, as it has done in other countries.
But how would you propose to get from here to there, given the reality that the Republicans have an even larger now base of support in Congress? They control all the houses, and now they'll soon have a much more conservative Supreme Court. How would you propose to get from where we are there to single payer?
Okay, well, we have another election in 21 months. We have another presidential election in less than 4 years. Things can change, and so we need to be thinking ahead. We've already seen a tremendous amount of change just from people getting out to town hall meetings, getting out on the streets, calling their congressmen. Who would have known, a few months ago that the Republicans would not be able to repeal Obamacare. You know, they haven't been able to do it largely because there's been pressure from the electorate on the purple state senators and congressmen. So people need to be out there in the streets. They need to be contacting their congressmen. They need to be demonstrating, educating, and preparing for the day when we really can get single payer, which may be sooner than you think.
So we keep throwing around that word single payer. Explain exactly what you mean. And is the Sanders plan, it's just been discussed this weekend, to go right to this? What would be this system in the United States?
Well, we haven't seen the Sanders bill yet, but the sort of things that Sanders and congressmen have been putting forward, like Congressman John Conyers, H.R. 676, would be, you know, everyone just pays their taxes and everyone is automatically eligible for a program like Medicare, only it would have no co-payments, no deductibles for covered services, no participation by the private health insurance industry. So expanded and improved Medicare, expanded to everyone, improved so it doesn't have the kind of gaps in uncovered services that do exist in the current Medicare program. We've been advocating that plan for decades. Frankly, Congressman Conyers and Senator Sanders have as well. And I'm not sure what the legislation is going to look like that gets introduced in the next few days by Welch and Sanders. But certainly over the long term, we need to be thinking
insurance companies.
Well, the insurance companies would have no role in an efficient Medicare for All program. Some of these insurance companies have overhead of 20%, meaning that you give them $1 in premiums and only 80 cents ever goes to a doctor or a hospital or a drug company. 20 cents stays right there with the insurance company for their overhead and profit. You have to compare that to traditional Medicare, where the overhead is 2 to 3%. So when you add up all of the administrative costs that insurance companies have, the administrative costs they impose on doctors like me and hospitals to try to send bills to multiple payers, we're talking about potential savings of $400 to $500 billion annually. That's the money we need to give universal health care to everyone.
And where do the various stakeholders in the industry, for instance, I know that the hospitals were very much opposed to the current legislation that the Republicans were pushing for, but where would the doctors and the hospitals and the pharmaceuticals and all these others stand in a battle over a Medicare for All?
Okay. Well, in the last battle around the Republican bill, there were no doctors groups, no real doctors groups supporting the bill. Everyone opposed it. Certainly nursing groups and hospitals were opposing it too. In a battle for single payer, things might line up a little different in that the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry will be totally and completely opposed to single payer. For the health insurance industry, it's a life or death battle, and we can expect them to use all of their lobbying clout to try to prevent it. Big Pharma hasn't been very happy in single payer systems because in single payer systems, they're forced to lower their prices, in fact, to about half of what people in the United States pay. And indeed, a single-payer system, by lowering those pharmaceutical prices, would save another $100 billion that we could use to cover people. So pharma's going to be opposed. Insurance industry, the most opposed because it's life and death for them.
So Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, former head of their RNC, said this weekend, Democrats, bring your proposals to us now. We're seeing a kind of civil war in the Republican Party. Will we see the same in the Democratic Party?
I'm doubtful about that. Certainly at this moment, the Democrats as an opposition party tend to unify. When they're actually running things, the divisions come out much more.
Well, Bernie Sanders is part of the leadership, so are you saying that the leadership might actually endorse a Medicare for All proposal? And what does a public option proposal mean, a pre-Medicare for All proposal?
Well, the way the leadership can be brought to endorse single payer is by us, the constituents, out there in the streets, calling them up, pressuring them in all the ways we have, saying we want single payer. That's what will bring the full Democratic leadership around on this. Public option would be a small step that would ease some of the pain. It would mean that when you were on the exchange buying things, one of your options would be to pay money and buy into Medicare. But, you know, most Americans do not get their care through the exchange, and the public option really doesn't generate those massive administrative savings that we need in order to be able to afford health care for everyone.
Dr. Steffi Wohlhandler, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Professor at CUNY Hunter College, primary care physician, lecturer at Harvard Medical School, co-founder of Physicians for a National Health Program. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to London to talk about what's happening right now in Iraq. Is it possible that the largest strike just occurred, an airstrike in Mosul, since the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003? Stay with us.
Down here on the corner of ruin and grace, I'm growing weary of the human race. Hold my lamp up in everyone's face, looking for an honest man. Everyone tied to the turning wheel, everyone hiding from the things they feel. The truth's so hard, it just don't seem real. The shadow across this land. People around here don't know what it means to suffer at the hands of our American dreams. Turn their backs on the grisly scenes, traced to the privileged sons. They got their God, they got their guns, got their armies and the chosen ones. But we'll all be burning in the same big sun when the great correction comes. Down through the ages, lovers.
Great Correction by Eliza Gilkison here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. In our next segment, we go to President Obama's approval of the permit for the Keystone, President Trump's approval for the Keystone XL. But right now, we turn to Iraq. Juan?
Well, the U.S.-backed Iraqi military's ground campaign to retake West Mosul from ISIS has been halted as details emerged over the weekend about U.S.-led coalition airstrikes that are believed to have killed over 200 people in a single day. The U.S.-led coalition has admitted launching airstrikes on March 17th that targeted a crowded neighborhood in Mosul. They are among the deadliest U.S. airstrikes in the region since the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. According to reports, one of these strikes hit an explosive-filled truck, triggering a blast that destroyed nearby houses where hundreds of people were taking refuge amid the city's heavy fighting. Up to 80 civilians, including women and children, may have died in one house's basement alone. This is a family member of some of the civilians killed in this strike.
I came to the house to stay with my family, but the owner of the house told me there were no place for me. More than 100 people were inside. Half an hour later, the house was hit in an airstrike. There were neither snipers nor ISIL militants on the street. At least 15 people from this street that links into the alleyways have been killed.
This bombing is just one of an onslaught of U.S.-led coalition airstrikes in Iraq and Syria that's killed as many as 1,000 civilians in March alone, according to the journalistic project Air Wars. Another one of these strikes occurred last week in Syria when a U.S. Reaper drone struck a gathering in the rebel-held village near Aleppo, killing as many as 49 people. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, most of the dead were civilians who'd gathered at a mosque to pray. The Pentagon acknowledged carrying out strikes in this village, but denied hitting a mosque. Pentagon officials said the gathering was a meeting of al-Qaeda. The high civilian death toll is leading many to question whether the U.S. military has loosened the rules of engagement that seek to limit civilian casualties. The Pentagon maintains the rules have not changed. Well, for more, we're going to London to speak to Chris Woods, founder of Air Wars, the nonprofit group that monitors civilian deaths from international airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. Chris Woods is also an award-winning reporter and author of Sudden Justice, America's Secret Drone Wars. Chris, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what you understand happened on March 17th in Iraq.
This is a very complicated event, and in fact, the story is still changing today. We know that a devastating explosion or sequence of explosions took place in the Al Jadida neighborhood, the new Mosul area, and a minimum of 101 civilians died. Some claims have placed the number of dead in that immediate neighborhood at over 500. We're talking a really catastrophic event. In terms of attributing responsibility, that's proving more challenging. The coalition, as you said, has said it did conduct an airstrike in the immediate vicinity on March 17th. But what's complicating this is that the Iraq military also appears to have conducted artillery strikes into that immediate area, and there may or may not have been ISIS booby traps or a vehicle-borne truck bomb. So it's a very complex event. We also, with the coalition, we don't know which coalition partners were involved in the event. The United States, most probably, but there are 4 other nations in the coalition also bombing quite heavily at Mosul at the moment. What we can absolutely say. So these are Australia, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and France. All of them have said that Mosul is where most of their airstrikes are now taking place. So a lot of people involved here. But of course, you know, the reality here is that more than 100 civilians certainly are dead. The Washington Post saying this morning that they've been speaking to civil defense in Baghdad, in Mosul, and a minimum of 101 bodies so far removed from the scene, and perhaps many more bodies there. And this is what leads to this report of this is possibly one of the highest ever reported civilian casualty events that the coalition or the U.S. may have been involved in.
And, Chris, The Guardian is reporting that Iraq has suspended the Mosul offensive after these attacks. What do you know about the accuracy of that report, and what's the situation in terms of the response of the Iraqi government?
Yeah, it was certainly reported that the campaign had been paused, but in fact, there's very little sign of that. The airstrikes have still been going in very heavily from not just the coalition, but also the Iraqis. 2 more neighborhoods were captured by Iraqi ground forces just yesterday from ISIS. So there may have been a slowing down of the campaign, but really, I think, you know, the coalition, the Iraq government is keen to capture West Mosul as quickly as possible. They're gambling here that the quicker they capture the city, the less overall risk of harm there is to civilians. But civilians are paying a terrible price here. According to one report last week, which appears to have come from a senior Iraq military official, 4,000 civilians had died in the first month of fighting for West Mosul. That's 1,000 civilians being killed a week at the moment. Those are very high numbers, unacceptable numbers in our view.
Now these casualties are far higher than in the last months of the Obama administration. Do you get any sense that this is as a result of changes in operation by U.S. forces in this particular offensive, or is just the fact that they're now moving into a highly populated area?
It's a really difficult one to untangle. There's no doubt that the number of allegations and reported fatalities are through the roof. We have more than 120 alleged civilian casualty events from the coalition so far in March. That's across Iraq and Syria, with more than 1,200 civilians reported killed, alleged killed by coalition actions. Those are way up there with the levels of allegations we saw against Russia last year when it was bombing across Syria. So these are very, very high levels of reported civilian casualties. Part of that is definitely to do with West Mosul. The UN had warned beforehand, aid agencies had warned, NGOs had warned there were going to be a lot of civilian casualties because so many civilians were trapped in the city. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And we're seeing far too many civilians killed in West Mosul. But we're seeing many civilians being reported killed in northern Syria as well, around Raqqa. And the assault on Raqqa itself hasn't even begun yet. And yet we're seeing 2, 3, 4 civilian casualty events a day around Raqqa. So, yes, civilian deaths are way up with the coalition. What's still somewhat difficult to untangle is whether we would have seen that under Obama. The strikes were rising, the deaths were rising steeply in the last months of Obama. Trump has obviously inherited Obama's battle plan to some degree. Even so, we're hearing from Iraqi officials that it is easier to call in airstrikes now, particularly U.S. strikes. So the picture's still confused. I actually think this is, we need a straight answer from the Pentagon, from the White House. Have they lifted restrictions that were there to protect civilians on the battlefield? Because ordinary Iraqis and Syrians have a right to know that. This is a life and death issue for them.
Chris Woods, I wanted to ask you about another recent harrowing attack involving the United States and its allies. In Syria, a U.S. Reaper drone recently struck a gathering in the rebel-held village in the province of Aleppo. As many as 49 people died. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, most of the dead were civilians who gathered at a mosque to pray. The Pentagon acknowledges carrying out strikes on the village, but denied hitting a mosque. They said the gathering was a meeting of al-Qaeda members. This is Syrian ambulance driver Munter Abu Ammar.
I'm an ambulance driver, Munter Abu Ammar, from Aleppo's western province. We came here after we were called, after an airstrike targeted the mosque while worshippers were inside. There are more than 30 martyrs, and dozens of injured people were transported to the Atta-Reb hospital. There are still many people who are missing, 5 or 6 missing people. One of the martyrs was an elderly woman who lived close to the mosque. God help us.
So that's a Syrian ambulance driver in Aleppo. Can you tell us what you understand happened there, Chris?
Well, every report from the ground is in agreement that this was a mosque complex, that it looks like the U.S. wasn't aware that a new building that had been built near the old mosque was an extension of that complex, and that hundreds of locals were gathered for a religious meeting when that unilateral U.S. strike took place. So this wasn't a coalition attack, it was a unilateral U.S.-targeted attack, the kind we've more usually seen in Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia. And it's part of this shadow war that only America has been conducting against al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria. It gets very little publicity, but in fact, many of these strikes taking place now. And again, they've ramped up under Trump, although in the last weeks of Obama, we saw quite a big jump in the number of those reports. Significant numbers of civilians killed in that event as well. I think one thing we're really seeing with Syria is poor intelligence. It seems CENTCOM did not know that that was a mosque building. And again, there was a school reported targeted and destroyed just last week in a place called Tabqa, near Raqqa. In that instance, the school was being used by internally displaced people, and there were reports of up to 100 families being in that building when it was struck. There's still a great deal of dispute about how many civilians died, but a minimum, we think, of about 35 civilians killed in that event as well. This is poor intelligence. Any local would have been able to tell them that IDPs, displaced civilians, were living in that building. And I think this is about the proxy force that America's using in Syria today, which are not from this area. The SDF, primarily Kurdish force, it's poor intelligence, it's strikes being conducted very quickly, and civilians on the ground in Syria are paying a significant price for that.
Chris, we just have a minute left. Certainly a huge amount of attention was paid to what happened in London with the killing of 4 people in an attack near the Parliament. There's almost no, in the United States, attention paid to this massive spike in casualties in Iraq and Syria.
You're right. I mean, there isn't an equivalence there. A few weeks ago, we were very critical of international media for not covering the civilian casualties in Iraq, in Syria. That's really changed now. Great work being done by international, regional, local media in both countries. Really outstanding journalism now looking at these civilian casualties. The disconnect is domestically. Where are the political voices being raised about this. There was a lot of anger from our politicians last year with Aleppo, and quite rightly so when so many civilians died. Where are the raised voices here on behalf of Syrians and Iraqis who are dying as a result of our bombs?
Chris Woods, I want to thank you for being with us, founder of Air Wars, the nonprofit group that monitors civilian deaths from international airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. Chris is an award-winning reporter and author of Sudden Justice, America's Secret Drone Wars. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, President Trump authorizes a permit to restart the Keystone XL pipeline, to authorize it. We'll get response from Bill McKibben. Stay with us.
Maybe they don't see me 'cause I'm small. Gotta find a way to make me 10 feet tall. 'Cause surely someone would do something if they knew about this war. Sometimes I think this world doesn't remember me at all. They told me freedom was gonna find you. Told me freedom was gonna change you. Well, I'm holding my mama by the hand, screaming freedom, here I am.
If They Knew About This War by Yasamin here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
The Trump administration has approved a permit allowing TransCanada to build the Keystone XL pipeline, which would transport 830,000 barrels of crude oil every day from Alberta's tar sands to refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast for export. Trump addressed reporters in the Oval Office on Friday morning.
Today, I'm pleased to announce the official approval of the presidential permit for the Keystone XL pipeline.
TransCanada's Keystone XL pipeline would cross the Yellowstone River as well as the Ogallala Aquifer, the largest freshwater aquifer in the United States. Republicans in the oil industry say the pipeline will create thousands of construction jobs and provide national energy security. However, environmentalists and scientists have long warned about the devastating impact of further fossil fuel extraction on a rapidly warming planet. Trump's approval of the Keystone XL pipeline is a reversal of the Obama administration's decision to halt the project in late 2015 following massive, sustained resistance from Native Americans, farmers, ranchers, and environmental groups. In response to Trump's decision to greenlight the project, the group 350.org tweeted, quote, U.S. State Department may approve Keystone XL, but the pipeline won't be built. People stopped it once and will again. On Friday, protesters gathered across from the Trump International Hotel in New York City and outside the White House in Washington, D.C.
The pipeline is not yet a done deal. The company TransCanada still needs to secure funding, acquire local permits, stave off potential legal challenges. Meanwhile, environmental groups and community organizers say they're gearing up for a major showdown with the Trump administration over its climate policy. Next month, protesters will gather in Washington, D.C. on March 29th for the People's Climate on April 29th for the People's Climate Mobilization, where they say they'll push forward a vision of a clean energy economy. For more, we're joined by Bill McKibben by Democracy Now! Video stream from his home in Vermont, co-founder of 350.org. Bill, talk about this announcement that was made on Friday. It seemed as if, Bill, this was right at the time when Trump was going down over health care, was extremely angry, and issued this unrelated executive order around the pipeline permit.
Yes, it was directly in between pretending to drive a big truck and losing on health care. And the interesting thing was he signed his piece of paper and then turned to the CEO of TransCanada and said, when does construction start? And the CEO of TransCanada looked a little abashed and said, well, we still have some permits to get in Nebraska, which is a great understatement. They've got a lot of work to do if this thing's ever going to get built. And there are lots of people standing in their way. What it really underscores, Amy, is how much the world has changed in the 6 years since this fight began. Look, 6 years ago, the world's climate scientists and others said this is a terrible idea. in the time that's come since, the price of a solar panel has dropped in half, and we've had the 3 hottest years in human history. The plan for the Keystone Pipeline, which was bad then, is preposterous now. And the only good news is that the fight against Keystone has gone on to spur thousands of other battles with other fossil fuel projects all over the world. And some of those were winning, some of those were losing, but every place, every oil well, every frack well, every coal mine, every coal port, every pipeline, they're all being fought.
Well, Bill, as you say, the price of solar panels has dropped, but also the price of oil has plummeted as well, and making it even less of a feasible project economically for those who are backing it. I'm wondering if you could talk about that, the issue of the oil economics, and also of the role of Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada on this issue.
Absolutely. And it's a really good question, Juan. Look, the tar sands is not only a climate disaster, it's more and more an economic disaster. The price of oil has fallen so far that people have abandoned tens of billions of dollars worth of plans for expansion. And the Trudeau government up in Canada is sort of operating in the shadow of the craziness of the Trump administration. Trump is so creepy and evil that everybody else looks somewhat normal in his, in his shadow. But Trudeau's the perfect example in this case of why that's not true. He went down to Houston a couple of weeks ago to speak to a bunch of oil men, and he had them up on their feet cheering when he said no nation would find 173 billion barrels of oil.
We have a clip of that. I want to turn to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking early this month.
I said on the very first trip to the oil patch back in 2012, no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and just leave them there.
You were talking about it. Go ahead.
That got a standing ovation from the oil guys. But since you guys were in Paris for the climate talks, you'll remember that it was Justin Trudeau in Canada that pushed hardest to have the world set a goal of not increasing the temperature more than 1.5 degrees. And he got a lot of credit for that. That 173 billion barrels of oil from the tar sands that he wants to dig up and burn represents 30% of the entire planet's carbon budget that would get us to 1.5 degrees. That is, a country with 0.5% of the planet's population wants to burn 30% of the planet's carbon budget. Trudeau and Trump in collaboration in the tar sands is a really sick picture. And that's why, Native and indigenous peoples on both sides of the border, it's why farmers and ranchers, it's why climate scientists, it's why all the rest of us are coming together around this fight and so many other fights.
Can you tell us how this fits into President Trump's larger plan involving the EPA, cutbacks there, ending climate research, et cetera, and what the plans are for April 29th in Washington?
His whole plan is, what can we do to save the oil industry? The oil industry is in trouble because demand is beginning to disappear. Yesterday, at midday in California, more than half of the state's electricity was being provided by renewables, a new record. That's pretty amazing. We're about to see the big advent of electric cars. These things terrify the oil industry because they destroy demand. That's why the Trump administration is getting rid of the mileage standards for cars. They're going to try and get rid of California's Clean Air Act exemptions. They're stopping climate research so no one will be noticing that we have less ice than we've ever had in the Arctic and the Antarctic. I mean, this is craziness, and the only possible response to that craziness is a lot of people in the streets, just as with healthcare, making it clear to our leaders that we simply won't accept this kind of retreat, this kind of return to the past. And that's what April 29th will be about. You remember, because you were there covering at the big climate march in New York City. This is the D.C. version 2 years later. And it comes on the 100th day of the president's administration. We got to make some noise.
Well, Bill McKibben, I want to thank you for being with us. We're going to ask you to stay with us for a post-show for a few minutes, talking about what's happening in places like Peru and with the record weather events that are taking place throughout the world. Bill McKibben is co-founder of 350.org, author of several books, including Earth, Making a Life on a Tough New Planet. That does it for our broadcast. We have a job opening. It is a news fellow. You can go to DemocracyNow.org. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.